Accessing library computer data.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Brian, and I am the host and game master of the role-playing game podcast Star Trek Tempest. Recently, I've seen a few requests out there for a succinct overview of the Star Trek Adventures rule system, which is what we use for our podcast. So I thought I would put one together and put it out there. Now, a huge caveat up front, we are not going to cover every nook and cranny of the rule system in this episode. We're going to keep it short and sweet and cover just the game's core mechanic in its basic form. However, in 6 minutes, you will have the bare minimum knowledge you need to bring a Star Trek Adventures scenario to your table. Okay, so how do you play Star Trek Adventures? The core game mechanic is what's called a task. A task is just an action that a character performs that is difficult, but not impossible, and where failure would produce interesting results. Now, not every action that a character does needs to be a task that the player rolls for. You can think of it as a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have actions that can be considered trivial. They're so easy that the player doesn't need to roll for them. For example, a character gets a cup of coffee from the replicator. The GM would just say, okay, I'm not going to make you roll for that, just go ahead and do it. On the other end of the spectrum are tasks that are so impossible that rolling for them at all would be futile. For example, let's think of something completely ridiculous and totally impossible, something just absolutely absurd on its face that anybody who even knew the first thing about Star Trek would know is just completely impossible. Let's say that a character wants to use the transporter to beam directly from Earth to Kronos. The GM would say, no, you can't do that, and you can't roll for it, because it's just flat outside the bounds of what's possible. In between these two are tasks, which are actions that the player would roll for to see if their character succeeds at. Tasks themselves are further divided into 5 difficulty levels. There is a difficulty 0, but that's a bit of a special case, so we're going to come back to it. And the difficulty level is just a way of saying how many successful rolls does the player need in order to succeed at that action. So a difficulty 1 task requires the player to roll 1 success. A difficulty 2, 2 successes, and so on. So how does one roll a success in the first place? Each character will have their main stats, which are 6 attributes and 6 disciplines. The attributes are things like control, daring, fitness, insight, presence, and reason. And if you're coming from a D&D background, these more or less map to dexterity, constitution, strength, wisdom, charisma, and intelligence. The 6 disciplines are the 6 departments you would find on a starship and that your character would have training in. There's command, con, which is piloting, security, engineering, science, and medicine. For any given task, the GM will decide what the relevant attribute and discipline for that task are. Let's say, for example, your character is trying to analyze some strange sensor readings. The GM would decide, okay, for a task like this, the relevant attribute and discipline is science and reason. So the player takes those 2 numbers, adds them together, and that produces the target number. The player then rolls between 2 and 5 d20s. By default, they always roll 2, and we'll go over how to roll more than 2 in a moment. And any number that is equal to or under a target roll is a success, while any number over is a failure. If the number of successful rolls is equal to or greater than the difficulty level, then the player succeeds at the task. And if not, they fail. So how does one succeed at a difficulty 3 or more task? By using momentum. Momentum is an in-game currency that the players share in a common pool that they then spend to, among other things, purchase additional dice. However, the price gets steeper with each additional purchase. So 1 die costs 1 point of momentum, 2 dice costs an additional 2 momentum, and 3 dice costs an additional 3 momentum for a total of 6. 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6 points of momentum equals 3 dice. So that's how you spend momentum. How do you earn momentum? For every success the player rolls that is above the task's difficulty level, 1 point of momentum is generated. So for example, let's say a player has rolled 3 successes on a difficulty 1 task. The first success goes to the task itself, while the other 2 successes become points of momentum. If that same roll is a difficulty 2 task, then 2 successes go to the task itself, and only the third success becomes a point of momentum. And if that same roll is a difficulty 3 task, then all 3 successes go to the task itself, and no new momentum is generated. This is also where difficulty 0 tasks come in. They are essentially optional, a way for the GM to offer the players an opportunity to generate momentum. But if they can't or don't want to for whatever reason, then the task can be considered trivial, and rolling for it can just be skipped altogether. And that's it. That is the basic, stripped-down version of the Star Trek Adventures core game mechanic. You now have the bare minimum knowledge you need to bring a basic Star Trek Adventures scenario to your table. Thanks for listening and watching. If you are listening to this as a podcast episode, you can watch it as a YouTube video with some helpful visualizations on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this as a YouTube video, you can download it as a podcast episode, so you always have it on hand. If you found this useful, please give us a like and subscribe. And if you'd like us to do more of these, then leave a comment on our YouTube page or on any of our social media accounts. Thanks very much for listening, everybody. You can find Star Trek Tempest on all of the podcast apps as Star Trek Tempest, and you can find us on social media as Starship Tempest, as well as at starshiptempest.com. Thanks very much for listening, and until next time, we'll see you out there.